She stood alone on the ridge at sunset, silhouetted against the rust-colored sky, and 12 men on horseback waited below for her answer. 12 warriors, 12 claims, 12 reasons why she should choose them. Bloodline, wealth, status, strength, all of them important in her world. All of them completely irrelevant to what she was about to do. Behind her, the Canyon de Chelly stretched endlessly, a landscape carved by centuries of wind and water, holding the stories of her people. In front of her, the men shifted restlessly, their horses stamping impatiently. And beside her, watching from a distance with an expression that suggested he didn't understand what was happening and wasn't sure he wanted to, stood a stranger. A white man, a cowboy, someone who had absolutely no claim on her hand, no right to be standing there at all. When she pointed, when she made her choice, everything changed. For all of them, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The trading post at Round Rock stood at the intersection of 3 territories: Navajo land to the north, Hopi to the east, and the vast open country to the south, where ranchers pushed cattle and settlers pushed dreams that didn't always belong to them. It was neutral ground, the kind of place where different worlds collided and sometimes managed to coexist. James Mitchell had been tending bar there for 6 years, ever since his cattle operation had failed during a brutal drought that killed half his herd and most of his optimism. He was good at the job. He didn't ask questions, he didn't judge, and he knew when to water down the whiskey and when to let a man drink straight. He was 34 years old, weathered by sun and disappointment, carrying the kind of weariness that came from trying to make it in a land that didn't much care whether you succeeded or failed. He didn't expect to notice her. The trading post got plenty of Navajo visitors, men and women passing through, conducting business, trading goods. But when she walked in, everything else seemed to fade into background noise. Her name was Elizabeth Whitehorse, though people called her Beth. She was 24 years old, daughter of Raymond Whitehorse, one of the most respected leaders among the Navajo in that region. She wore traditional dress, a velvet blouse the color of deep crimson, a silver concho belt, her long black hair wrapped in white yarn. But it was her eyes that stopped men in their tracks. Dark eyes that seemed to see everything, that carried intelligence and humor and a kind of sadness that suggested she'd already witnessed too much of the world's complications. She came to the trading post to see Thomas Abbott, the owner, about trading some of her mother's woven blankets for supplies the family needed. The blankets were beautiful, intricate geometric patterns in natural dyes, each one representing hours of careful work. Thomas examined them with the eye of someone who knew their value and wouldn't try to cheat her, which was part of why her family dealt with him. James found himself hovering nearby, pretending to restock bottles, actually just watching. He'd learned to recognize the difference between being attracted to someone and recognizing something in them that called to something in you. This was the latter, which scared him more than it should have. Beth didn't seem to notice him. She negotiated with Thomas in English that was perfect, but carried the lilt of her native language beneath it. She was patient, precise, and when Thomas tried to lowball his offer, she pushed back with logic so clear he had to raise it. The transaction completed, she turned to leave, and James found himself stepping into her path without consciously deciding to do so. "The blankets are extraordinary," he said, which was a stupid opening, but it was what came out. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the physical world. "My mother made them," Beth said simply. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. "The patterns are stories. Each one tells something different." James wanted to ask what stories these particular blankets told. Wanted to keep her talking, but Thomas was already wrapping the items she'd purchased. and there were other customers waiting. Beth gathered her goods and left. James watched her go, knowing he'd just witnessed something important, knowing that one conversation had shifted something fundamental in how he saw the world. 2 weeks later, Beth came back. This time she brought her brother Daniel and her father Raymond. The men came to discuss a water rights issue with Thomas. The trading post drew water from a shared source, and there'd been tension about usage and compensation. It was business, practical, the kind of negotiation that happened constantly on the frontier where resources were scarce and tempers ran hot. But somewhere in the middle of the discussion, Raymond noticed how James had greeted his daughter. The respectful nod, the genuine smile, the way his eyes lingered for just a fraction of a second longer than pure politeness required. Raymond Whitehorse was a man who understood power dynamics. He'd navigated between Navajo tradition and white settlement, between the old ways and the new realities, with a combination of intelligence and careful pragmatism. He was 58 years old, with a face lined by decades of sun and decision-making. His black hair, braided and wrapped with white yarn like his daughters wore hers, had threads of grey that he wore like badges of surviving long enough. To earn them, he excused himself from the business discussion and found James in the back storeroom. "The way you look at my daughter," Raymond said without preamble. "What is that?" James could have lied. Should have. Instead, he told the truth. Respect, and a kind of recognition, I think. Like I'm seeing someone real for the first time in a long while. Raymond studied him for a long moment. You understand that Beth has obligations. Family obligations. There are protocols that go back generations about who she might choose to spend her life with. I do understand that, James said. And I also understand that I'm not the person she would choose. I'm just a man running a bar who happened to notice someone remarkable. Something shifted in Raymond's expression then, a kind of respect for the honesty. Beth turns 25 next month, he said. There will be a gathering, a coming-of-age ceremony, but also something else. An opportunity for her to choose who she wants to walk with, according to our traditions. 12 warriors have already made their intentions known. 12 men from our people, each with something to offer, each believing he should be the one she selects. That sounds important, James said carefully. It is, Raymond agreed. But I'm telling you this because I see something in you, and I suspect you see something in Beth, if you want to understand her world. If you want to understand what she means when she talks about the stories her blankets tell, you should be there. You should witness the gathering. Not as a participant, that wouldn't be appropriate, but as a witness. As someone trying to understand, James didn't know what to say. This wasn't an invitation in the traditional sense. It was something more complex. An opening, a challenge maybe, a chance to see something that mattered and decide if he was willing to accept what he saw. The ceremony was set for a month away, in the high country north of the trading post, near the place where Beth's extended family maintained their seasonal camp. Raymond gave James directions and told him what to expect, then offered a warning. Whatever you feel now, whatever you think you might want, understand that witnessing the gathering will likely change that. You'll see what she means to our people. You'll understand the weight of her choices in ways that will probably hurt. I understand, James said, though he didn't. Not really. How could he understand something before he'd lived it? The next 4 weeks passed in a strange suspension. James worked his shifts at the trading post, served whiskey to drifters and businessmen, and found himself thinking about Beth in odd moments, wondering what stories she would tell about her life, what it meant to belong to a community so completely that choosing a husband wasn't just a personal decision, but a responsibility to everyone around you. What it felt like to have that kind of weight on your shoulders at 24. He'd lived his whole life making individual choices, deciding to try ranching, deciding it had failed, deciding to work at the trading post. His decisions had affected only himself. He couldn't quite imagine what it would mean to make a choice that reverberated through an entire extended family, through an entire community's understanding of alliances and futures and continuations. When the time came to ride out to the gathering, James packed his gear and set out before dawn, following the directions Raymond had given him. The terrain gradually shifted from the flat scrubland around the trading post to increasingly rough country, canyons and rock formations, pinon and juniper that grew more densely the farther north he traveled. He found the camp in a wide valley surrounded by red rock formations that glowed like embers in the afternoon light. There were dozens of people gathered, families setting up camp, cooking fires already beginning to smoke, the sounds and bustle of a community assembling. And there, standing with a group of women near a large traditional hogan, was Beth. She wore her hair loose today, and it fell in a dark river past her shoulders. Her dress was more elaborate than what he'd seen before, layered velvet in rich purples and blues, silver jewelry catching the light with each movement. She looked like someone from another world, one where women carried the actual weight of tradition and continuity rather than just the idea of it, and arranged around the camp. Still arriving on horseback were the warriors, the 12 men. They were impressive individually and intimidating collectively. Strong young men from prominent families, skilled hunters and fighters, men who had already proven themselves through deeds and achievements. One rode a horse that must have cost a fortune. Another was so tall he seemed to overshadow everyone around him. A third had the bearing of someone born to authority. They circled the gathering like planets orbiting a star, aware of each other's presence, sizing each other up. This was a competition, James realized. Not openly acknowledged, but understood by everyone present. A trial where the prize was Beth herself, and the stakes were family honor, alliances, futures. James found Raymond near the edge of camp and approached quietly. The older man seemed unsurprised to see him. "Come," Raymond said. "I'll introduce you to my wife. She's been expecting you." And so James Mitchell found himself absorbed into the periphery of a ceremony he didn't fully understand. Watching the woman he couldn't stop thinking about, prepare to choose between 12 men who actually belonged in her world. Waiting to see what would happen when tradition met something unexpected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ceremony began at dawn, with the sun breaking over the eastern ridges like fire spreading across water. Raymond's wife, Margaret, had welcomed James the night before with a kindness that suggested Raymond had prepared her for his arrival. She was a woman in her mid-50s, with the kind of presence that made people listen when she spoke. She'd given James a place to sleep near the edge of the family camp and included him in the evening meal without making a fuss about his being an outsider. Now, as the sun climbed, the entire gathering assembled in a natural amphitheater formed by the surrounding rock formations. The 12 warriors stood in a line, each with something to demonstrate. This wasn't arbitrary. In Navajo tradition, a man's worthiness wasn't just about his intentions. It was about his demonstrated ability to provide, to protect, to lead. The gathering was designed to test these things publicly, giving Beth and her family concrete evidence of what each man could offer. The first trial was horsemanship and tracking. The warriors were given a specific route they had to follow, marked by subtle signs, a tied branch here, a stone arrangement there, that only someone with real skill could read quickly. They had to navigate the course at speed, demonstrating both their knowledge of the land and their ability to handle horses under pressure. James watched from the sidelines as the 12 men set out, their horses kicking up dust clouds that hung in the morning air. The warrior who finished first was named Marcus, a man in his late 20s with the lean build of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He rode with absolute confidence, anticipating terrain before he reached it, handling his horse with barely perceptible movements. When he returned to the gathering point, he was breathing hard but barely sweating, which suggested the effort hadn't truly taxed him. His family erupted in cheers. Others followed, with varying levels of success. One young warrior, probably only 20, made a critical error reading one of the trail markers and went in the wrong direction, costing him time. Another's horse spooked at a rattlesnake and threw him, though he managed to land on his feet and complete the course on foot, which earned him respect for persistence but cost him in the final standings. By the time all 12 had finished, it was clear that Marcus, a hunter named David, and a warrior named Frank from a prominent family were the front-runners. Between trials, there was food and conversation. James found himself standing near Thomas Abbott, the trading post owner, who'd come to the gathering as a guest of Raymond's. Apparently this wasn't entirely unusual, as outsiders sometimes attended to witness important community events. "Watch the politics," Thomas murmured, handing James a plate of food. "The trials matter, but family alliances matter more. Beth's father is respected, but that doesn't mean every family sees her as equally valuable. Some of these warriors are here because their fathers sent them, hoping to create connections. Others are genuinely interested in Beth. You'll see the difference as the day goes on." "How?" James asked. "The ones who are genuinely interested will watch her during the trials, will try to catch her eye, will adjust their performances based on what they think she values. The ones who are here because they were told to be will barely glance at her. They'll be focused on impressing the other families, the community leaders, anyone who might matter for their future." Thomas was right. As James observed, he began to see the patterns. Marcus, the hunter, kept looking toward where Beth stood with her mother and aunts. When he completed the tracking course, his eyes found hers, seeking approval. Frank, by contrast, seemed to barely acknowledge that Beth was present. His performances were directed at Raymond and the other male leaders. The second trial was different. It was a test of practical knowledge. Each warrior had to demonstrate his ability to solve real problems that might arise in daily life. They were presented with scenarios. A child has been injured and needs immediate care with limited supplies. A family's water source has become contaminated. A structure is damaged in a storm and needs to be repaired quickly. Each warrior had to explain how he would handle the situation, drawing on knowledge of healing, engineering, medicine, and practical survival. This trial revealed different capabilities than the first. David, who'd done well in the tracking course, showed surprising knowledge of traditional medicine. Marcus struggled more here, his strength in hunting not translating to these kinds of technical problems. A quieter warrior named Charles, whom James hadn't particularly noticed before, demonstrated extensive knowledge of construction and structural repair. He spoke with such clarity and confidence that even James, who knew nothing about Navajo building techniques, could understand the logic of his approach. Beth watched this trial with visible interest. James noticed her leaning forward slightly as Charles explained his methodology. He saw her exchange a glance with her mother that suggested they were both impressed. This was information that mattered to her. Not just that a man could ride a horse or hunt, but that he could think through complex problems systematically. By midday, the physical trials were finished, and the family took a break for a substantial meal. Beth was kept largely separate from the warriors during this time, a tradition that seemed designed to prevent any one-on-one courtship pressure. But James noticed that she positioned herself where she could observe the warriors while they ate and rested. What struck him was how different each man was. Marcus was charismatic and confident, telling stories that made people laugh. David was quieter, more introspective, but had a gravity to him that suggested depth. Frank was arrogant, making comments about the other warriors' performances that bordered on insulting. Charles was kind, helping younger boys with small tasks, checking on an older woman who seemed to be uncomfortable in the heat. James found himself trying to predict what Beth would choose. Based on what he'd observed, it seemed like it should be either Charles for his competence and kindness, or Marcus for his overall skill and presence. But he was beginning to understand that he didn't know enough about Beth's values to make that prediction with any confidence. Everything he thought he knew about her came from 2 brief conversations at a trading post. The woman he was watching now, intelligent, observant, carefully assessing each man, was someone he was only beginning to know. The final trial was the most personal. In the late afternoon, each warrior was given the opportunity to speak directly to Beth and her family about why he believed he should be chosen. It was part explanation, part demonstration of character, part pledge of commitment. The speeches were formal but revealing. Marcus went first, speaking about his hunting skills and ability to provide for a family, but also about his genuine affection for Beth, which he'd apparently harbored for some time. David spoke about stability and shared values, about understanding the importance of tradition and community. Frank spoke mostly about his family's status and wealth, which seemed to be a significant miscalculation. James could see Raymond's expression harden as Frank talked more about what his family could offer than about Beth herself. Charles spoke last among the first group, and his words were different. He talked about respect, not just for Beth, but for the concept that a partnership should be built on genuine partnership, not ownership. He spoke about wanting to build something together, not just provide for someone. He spoke about the responsibility of being trusted with someone's future. When Charles finished speaking, there was a moment of silence, and James saw several people in the gathering exchange looks, the kind of looks that suggested something important had just been said. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. The remaining warriors would speak tomorrow, which meant the gathering would continue into at least another day. Families began preparing evening meals. Fires were lit as darkness fell. James sat apart from the main camp, watching the smoke rise from a dozen different fires, each family group maintaining their own space, while still being part of the larger whole. He was thinking about something Thomas had said, about the difference between warriors who were performing for the community and warriors who were genuinely trying to show Beth who they were. He was also thinking about the fact that none of these men seemed to see what he saw when he looked at Beth. They saw a prize, or an opportunity, or a responsibility. They didn't seem to see that she was a person with her own thoughts and dreams and questions about the future. They were trying to convince her to choose them based on external qualities. But from what James had observed over the course of the day, Beth seemed to be looking for something else entirely, something that went beyond skill or status or family connections. He didn't know what that something was, but he was beginning to understand that when Beth made her choice, it was going to surprise people. And he suspected that understanding that surprise was going to change everything he thought he knew about love and partnership and the way people decided to spend their lives. The second day of the gathering brought a different energy. The remaining warriors, the last 9 who hadn't yet given their formal speeches, were preparing to present themselves. But before the day's trials began, James found himself pulled aside by Margaret, Beth's mother. She was holding 2 cups of coffee and gestured for him to sit with her near the family's fire. James complied, uncertain what this meant, but sensing that refusing would be worse than accepting. "My husband speaks highly of your character," Margaret said without preamble. "He says you work hard, that you're honest, that you don't pretend to be something you're not. These are valuable qualities." James didn't know how to respond to that, so he waited. "Beth came to me last night," Margaret continued. "She asked about you, who you were, why you were here, whether you had family or people who depended on you. She asked these questions in a way that suggested more than casual curiosity. James felt his chest tighten. I don't want to cause problems. Your husband invited me to witness the gathering. I came because... He stopped, unsure how to articulate why he'd come. Because you wanted to understand her, Margaret finished. Yes, Raymond explained that. What I want to understand is whether you understand what it would mean if Beth were to choose someone outside our community. If she were to choose you. The question hung in the cold morning air between them. James realized he hadn't truly let himself think about this possibility. He'd told himself he was here to witness, to understand, to be present. But underneath that, something else had been growing. A hope that maybe, despite all logic, despite all the impossibility of it, Beth might see something in him worth choosing. I understand it would change everything for her, James said carefully. That it would affect her standing in the community, her relationship with her family, her future in ways I can't fully comprehend. I understand that choosing me would mean leaving behind a world I barely understand, for a life I'm not sure I could provide adequately for. Margaret studied him over her coffee. And yet you came anyway. Yes, why? James thought about how to answer honestly. Because when I met Beth at the trading post, something happened that I can't explain. Like I recognized something in her that I've been looking for without knowing what it was. And I wanted to understand that feeling before I decided it was impossible and walked away from it. Margaret set down her coffee. Beth is not like other young women in our community. She reads. She asks questions about the world beyond these mountains. She studied the white man's education when she could access it. She's interested in things that traditional warriors don't value. This makes her difficult for some families to understand. Her father's family is progressive, but even they sometimes wonder if she's becoming too much like the outside world. What does Beth wonder? James asked. That's what she needs to discover. That's partly why this gathering exists, not just to choose a husband, but to understand what she actually wants from life, what she values, what kind of partnership would make her happy rather than simply satisfied. Margaret stood, signaling the conversation was ending. When the final choice is made, understand that it's hers to make. Not mine, not her father's, not the warrior's, hers alone. And she will live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of her life. The day proceeded with the remaining warriors presenting their skills and their words. There was a young warrior named William who came from a wealthy family but was genuinely humble about his advantages. There was an older warrior, perhaps 40, named Robert, whose stable and mature presence suggested he'd seen enough of life to know what actually mattered. There were others, some impressive, some forgettable, all of them clearly suitable in different ways. But something had shifted in James's understanding after speaking with Margaret. He realized that the gathering wasn't just about the warriors proving themselves. It was about Beth proving something to herself. Every warrior she evaluated, every speech she heard, every demonstration of skill or character, it was all data she was using to clarify her own values and priorities. As the day progressed, James noticed something else. The warriors who'd impressed him the previous day, Marcus, David, Charles, began to seem different when he observed them through this new lens. Marcus's charisma started to feel like performance. David's introversion started to feel like withholding. Charles's kindness started to feel like people-pleasing that might prevent him from making difficult decisions. And then there was the moment when Beth actually spoke to one of the warriors, directly. It happened during the late afternoon, between formal events. Beth had stepped away from her family to gather water, and one of the warriors, a man named Henry, who'd been quiet and unassuming during all the trials, approached her. They weren't supposed to have direct contact before the final decision, but Henry apparently hadn't cared about that rule. James watched from a distance as they talked. Henry was animated in a way he hadn't been during the formal presentations. He was making Beth laugh about something, gesturing expressively, fully present in the conversation, rather than performing for an audience. And Beth was different too, more relaxed, more herself. When their conversation ended and Henry walked away, Beth stood still for a moment, holding the water containers, looking at something distant that only she could see. James realized he was witnessing her in the process of revising her understanding of someone, recognizing dimensions of a person that the formal trials hadn't revealed. That evening, after the formal events were concluded and people had dispersed to their family camps, James found himself unable to sleep. He walked to the edge of the gathering, where the land opened out toward the south, toward the trading post and the wider world beyond. He was sitting on a rock, thinking about everything Margaret had said when Beth found him. She appeared like she'd been looking for him specifically, which both thrilled and terrified him. "You're not sleeping," she said. "It wasn't a question. Neither are you," James replied. Beth sat down beside him, close enough that he could smell the smoke from the fires on her clothes. "My mother said you explained why you came. She said you were honest about not knowing if you could provide what I need." "I meant that," James said. "I don't know your world well enough to be certain of anything." "But you came anyway," Beth echoed what her mother had said. "Knowing it was probably foolish, knowing I'd likely choose one of the warriors, knowing that being here would probably hurt." "Yes." Beth was quiet for a long time. "Do you know what my mother told me about you? She said the most important thing about a person isn't what they can provide or what they've accomplished. It's whether they're willing to learn, whether they approach things they don't understand with curiosity instead of judgment, whether they can sit with uncertainty without needing to rush to conclusions. Those are valuable qualities," James said carefully. "They are," Beth agreed. "They're also uncommon. I've watched the warriors all day, and most of them are very certain about things. About what I need, about what's best for me, about their own capabilities and rightness for this role." She turned to look at him. "You're uncertain about all of those things. Does that bother you?" "It terrifies me," James admitted, "because uncertainty feels like weakness when there are 12 men out there who seem to have everything figured out." Beth smiled slightly. "That's the difference, though. They seem certain, but certainty built on conviction is different from certainty built on not knowing enough to doubt. I've been thinking all day about which kind each man possesses. And I've been thinking about what kind of certainty I want to build a life with." She paused. "My family expects me to choose one of the warriors. It's what tradition dictates. It's what makes sense." James's heart was pounding. But I'm beginning to wonder if what makes sense for everyone else is the same as what makes sense for me," Beth said. "And I'm wondering if the person I should choose is someone who's already familiar with the cost of that choice. Someone who knows what he's risking and chooses it anyway, because he believes it might be worth it." She stood then, before James could respond, before he could say anything that might break the moment or make it too real. "The final choice happens tomorrow at sunset," she said. "All 12 warriors will stand before the community, and I will select one. My mother and father will want me to choose a Navajo warrior. The community will expect it, and there are genuinely good men among them who would provide for me and honor me." She paused. "But I'm not always good at doing what people expect. I read books about worlds beyond these mountains. I ask questions that make traditionalists uncomfortable. I'm not the daughter my father expected to have. Is that a problem?" James asked. "Only if I make it one," Beth replied. "Only if I let other people's expectations become the foundation of my choices." She looked back at him. "Tomorrow you'll see what I decide, and then you'll have to decide what you do with that choice. Whether you're brave enough to actually follow through on the certainty you're not even sure you feel." She walked back toward the family camp before James could respond, leaving him alone with the night and the impossible hope that had somehow taken root despite every rational reason it shouldn't exist. The final day of the gathering arrived with an electric tension that everyone could feel. The sun climbed toward its zenith, and people began assembling in the natural amphitheater where the trials had taken place. This time, the gathering wasn't for demonstrations or speeches. This was for the choice itself. Beth would stand before her family and her community, and she would point to the man she wanted to spend her life with. That choice would either honor tradition or shatter it. Either way, it would reverberate through the community for years to come. By sunset, nearly 200 people had gathered. The 12 warriors stood in a line, arranged in the order they'd completed the first day's trials. They wore their finest clothing, their hair wrapped and decorated, their bearing formal and dignified. Each one carried himself as if he was the obvious choice, the man who would be selected. James stood at the back of the gathering with Thomas Abbott. He was acutely aware that he didn't belong here, that he was an outsider witnessing something sacred. His heart was racing in a way that felt almost out of control. He kept reminding himself that Beth had 12 genuinely good options. Options that made sense. Options that wouldn't destroy her standing in her community. Raymond stepped forward and addressed the gathering. He spoke in Navajo first, words James couldn't understand but could feel the weight of. Then he switched to English, likely for the benefit of the traders and outsiders present. "My daughter Elizabeth has reached the age where she chooses her own path," Raymond said. His voice carried across the valley with the authority of someone used to being listened to. "This gathering has shown us the character and capability of 12 warriors who believe they can walk that path with her. But ultimately the choice is hers alone. The tradition is clear. She will point to the man she chooses, and he will be honored as her partner. Whatever she chooses, we will respect." There was weight in those final words. Whatever she chooses, even if it defied expectation, even if it complicated things, even if it wasn't what the community predicted, Beth stepped forward then. She wore a dress that seemed to glow in the setting sunlight, deep navy velvet, covered with intricate silver embroidery that caught the light with each movement. Her hair was wrapped in white yarn, decorated with silver ornaments. She looked like someone who belonged to this landscape, who carried the weight of generations in her bearing. She walked slowly along the line of 12 warriors. James watched her face as she looked at each one. Marcus, the skilled hunter, flexed slightly, as if that might influence her decision. David maintained his quiet composure. Charles smiled encouragement. Frank looked almost bored. Henry, the quiet warrior she'd spoken to the previous evening, watched her with an expression of genuine hope. She reached the end of the line and paused. For a moment that seemed to stretch like an eternity, she stood still. James held his breath. This was it. This was the moment where everything would be decided. Then Beth turned. She wasn't pointing to any of the 12 warriors. She was pointing at James. The amphitheater exploded. Not in cheers, but in sound. Gasps, exclamations, words spoken rapidly in both Navajo and English. James felt the blood drain from his face. His first instinct was to look around to see if there was someone behind him that Beth might actually be indicating. There wasn't. She was pointing directly at him. The 12 warriors on the line shifted uncomfortably. Some looked angry. Others looked shocked. Marcus's expression hardened into something that suggested he was experiencing real hurt beneath the anger. Raymond's face went very still. The kind of stillness that suggested he was processing something that violated his expectations, even if he'd somehow known it might be coming. Beth walked toward James. Moving through the crowd, her eyes locked on his. When she reached him, she took his hand. Her grip was strong and steady, and James realized she'd made this decision clearly. This wasn't a moment of reckless impulse. This was something she'd decided and committed to. "This is James Mitchell," Beth said, speaking so the entire gathering could hear. "He came from outside our community because my father invited him to witness this gathering. He came not knowing what he would find, not expecting anything. willing to be changed by what he saw. That willingness, that openness, that respect for things he didn't understand, that's what I choose. Raymond stepped forward, and James braced for anger or rejection. Instead, Raymond put his hand on James's shoulder. "You understand what you're accepting?" Raymond asked quietly, speaking low enough that only James could hear. "The community will struggle with this. Some families will see it as a betrayal of tradition. Some will see it as my daughter being taken by an outsider. Your life is going to become complicated in ways you can't prepare for." "I understand," James said. And he did, or at least he was beginning to. "And you understand that my daughter is not a prize you've won. That she's choosing a partnership, not surrendering herself to you?" "Yes, sir." Raymond nodded slowly, then turned to address the gathering. He spoke in Navajo, and James heard the words, "my daughter and her choice," and something that sounded like acceptance, even if not enthusiasm. The reaction in the gathering was mixed. Some people seemed genuinely pleased. Others looked troubled. A few stood and walked away, which James understood as a form of protest. The 12 warriors dispersed, some with grace and some with obvious bitterness. Marcus left without looking back, but others remained, and gradually people began approaching Beth and James. Some offered genuine congratulations. Some offered what James interpreted as hesitant acceptance. Thomas Abbott came over and shook James's hand, then hugged Beth, which seemed to carry weight coming from someone outside the community. Margaret appeared with tears on her face, and she embraced both of them. "You did what you needed to do," she told Beth, then looked at James. "Now you have to prove that her choice was right. That's going to be the real test." As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red, people began to depart. Some families headed back to their camps. Others began the journey home. The gathering was dissolving, its purpose served, its consequence set in motion. That evening, after most people had left, Beth and James sat together on the same rock where he'd waited the night before. But everything was different now. He wasn't a secret possibility. He was the choice that had been made, the disruption to tradition. The outsider who would now presumably become part of this community. "Are you afraid?" Beth asked him. James considered lying, but he'd already established that honesty was what mattered between them. "Terrified," he admitted. "I don't know your language well. I don't understand all your traditions. I don't know if I can provide what you need or be what your community will accept." "Neither of those things changed from yesterday to today," Beth pointed out. "What changed is that I acknowledged publicly what I decided privately, that I chose someone who's willing to learn rather than someone who already thinks he knows everything. Your family will adjust," Beth interrupted. "My mother is already planning how we'll navigate the community's concerns. My father is already thinking about how this might create new trading opportunities between your world and ours. They're not happy to have me choose differently than expected. But they're also people who understand that the world is changing, and we can either change with it or be left behind." James looked at her, at this woman who'd somehow seen something in him worth choosing, despite every rational reason not to. "What happens now?" he asked. "Do we go back to the trading post? Do we stay here? What do we do?" "That's for us to decide together," Beth said. "Not my father, not the community, not tradition. Us. What do you want to do?" It was a question that would have paralyzed James a week ago. But something had shifted in him during the gathering. He'd watched Beth navigate expectations and make a choice that honored her own values over everyone else's comfort. Maybe that was the real lesson of this whole experience. That love wasn't about fitting into predetermined roles. It was about two people deciding to build something new together, even when that newness was frightening and complicated and absolutely uncertain. "I want to learn," James said finally. "Your language, your traditions, the stories behind the blankets your mother makes." I want to understand the world you come from, so I can actually be worthy of the choice you made. And I want to help you figure out what comes next, whatever that looks like." Beth smiled. And it was the same smile that had stopped him in his tracks at the trading post. But now it was directed at him with intention and decision behind it. "Then that's what we'll do," she said. "Together." In the distance, the canyon walls absorbed the last of the day's light, holding the day's events in the stone, making them permanent in a way that nothing else could. Somewhere in that vast landscape, the choice Beth had made was already becoming part of the story that would be told. The story of the Navajo girl who pointed at the cowboy alone. The story of what happens when two people from different worlds decide to build something together anyway. The first month after the gathering was a test of commitment that James hadn't anticipated. The decision to leave the ceremonial grounds was straightforward. They would travel to the trading post, establish themselves there, and begin the work of building a life together. But the journey itself revealed how much had changed. On the road back, they encountered other members of the community traveling in the same direction. Some acknowledged them with respectful nods. Others deliberately avoided eye contact, their silence more cutting than any spoken criticism. One family, related to Marcus through his mother's line, actually turned their horses around and went a different route rather than travel alongside James and Beth. Beth noticed but didn't comment on these slights. Instead, she focused on teaching James basic Navajo phrases and explaining the significance of landmarks they passed. She was deliberately choosing to move forward rather than dwell on rejection, but James could see the toll it took. Her shoulders were slightly more rigid. Her smile, usually ready and genuine, required visible effort. When they reached the trading post, the complications deepened in unexpected ways. Thomas Abbott, who'd been supportive at the gathering, now found himself in an awkward position. His business depended on community relationships, and several Navajo traders who'd previously done business with him made it clear that his support of James and Beth's partnership had consequences. "I'm not abandoning you," Thomas told James one afternoon, speaking in the back office of the trading post. "But I need to be careful. I have business interests on both sides of the cultural line. If I'm perceived as too openly supporting this partnership, I lose credibility with some families. I need you to understand that." James did understand, but it was a harsh lesson in how personal decisions had ripple effects across entire communities. Thomas would help, but quietly. He could provide employment and housing, but he couldn't publicly champion their choice. The more significant challenge came from James's own world. The ranchers and businessmen who frequented the trading post had strong opinions about white men who took up with Indian women. Some were congratulatory in ways that made James's skin crawl, comments that treated Beth as a trophy or a conquest rather than a person. Others were openly hostile, suggesting that James had betrayed his own people, that he was corrupting something that should remain separate. One evening, a man named Edward Carlson, who owned one of the larger ranches in the territory, confronted James directly. "You understand what you're doing?" Carlson asked, his voice low but aggressive. "You're not just marrying an Indian woman. You're aligning yourself with her people. You're saying you believe their ways are equal to ours. You're weakening the position of everyone who's trying to establish proper civilization in this territory." James felt anger kindle in his chest. "What I'm doing is building a life with someone I care about. What you're doing is pretending that civilization requires oppression." "Don't be naive," Carlson shot back. "These territories won't be civilized by treating Indians as equals. They'll be civilized by managing them, controlling them, making them understand that they're subjects of progress, whether they like it or not. Men like you, men who go native, you undermine that entire project." James didn't respond. He'd learned that arguing with men like Carlson was futile, but the conversation stayed with him, a reminder that he wasn't just facing community disapproval from Beth's side. He was facing it from his own world, too. Beth observed all of this with her characteristic clarity. One evening, about 3 weeks after they'd arrived at the trading post, she found James sitting alone in the back, looking through ledgers with no real focus. "You're wondering if this was a mistake," she said. "It wasn't a question. I'm wondering if I'm strong enough for this," James replied honestly. "I'm watching you lose relationships with your community. I'm watching my own world treat me like I'm a traitor. And I'm asking myself whether I was foolish to think this could work." Beth sat across from him. "Do you know why I chose you?" she asked. "Because I was willing to learn." "That's part of it. But the real reason is because you were willing to sit with uncertainty, to not pretend to have all the answers." Most of the warriors at the gathering had decided exactly who they were and what they wanted. They were certain, but certainty without the willingness to question it is just rigidity. Beth paused. "Now you're facing the real test. Now you're learning that certainty is easy. What's hard is staying committed when the cost becomes visible." "I'm not sure I'm equal to that," James said. "Neither was I," Beth replied, "until I was forced to be." She reached across the table and took his hand. "My father is offering us an alternative. He said we could come live at the seasonal camp, that I could return to my community fully, and you could be part of that world if you're willing to truly be part of it, not just visit occasionally. It would mean leaving the trading post. It would mean giving up the kind of life you had planned." James's first instinct was panic. Leaving the trading post meant leaving the only secure income he had. It meant relying entirely on Raymond's hospitality and his own willingness to adapt to a way of life he didn't fully understand yet. It meant choosing her world over his own completely, not just nominally. "What do you want?" James asked. "I want to go home," Beth said simply. "I want to be with my family and my community. But I won't go without you, unless that's what you choose. If you need to stay here, if you need the security of work, you understand, and a place where your status isn't constantly questioned, I'll understand that." It was a test, James realized. Not a cruel one, but a real one. Beth was asking him to put his choices where his mouth was. To actually commit, not just to her, but to her world. To accept the loss of status and security that such a commitment would require. "When would we go?" James asked. "My father said whenever we're ready. Spring would be ideal. It gives us time to prepare, but it could be sooner." James thought about the past month, about the rejection and judgment, about the casual racism from men like Carlson, about the distance creeping into his relationships with people he'd considered friends. He thought about what it felt like to stand beside Beth in spaces where he didn't belong. The trading post, the community gathering, and watching her navigate being an outsider in her own territory. "I want to go," he said. "I want to learn. I want to be part of your world, not just a visitor to it. But I need to know it's not going to destroy you." "It's already destroying things," Beth said quietly. "My choice destroyed the expectations my community had. It's already changing my status, my possibilities, my relationships. That's the cost of choosing what you believe in instead of what's expected. But it's my cost to pay. What I need to know is whether you understand the cost of your choice too." Over the next month, James began the process of transitioning out of his position at the trading post. Thomas found a new manager, someone with fewer entanglements. James worked with him to ensure a smooth handover, maintained good relationships despite the awkwardness, and focused his energy on learning about the Navajo way of life. He studied the language with dedicated intensity. He asked questions, sometimes naive, sometimes insightful, about traditions and history, and the way Beth's community understood their place in the rapidly changing territory. He read everything he could find about Navajo history, culture, and current political situation. and he prepared himself for the fact that he would likely never be fully accepted by either community. He would always be the white man in the Navajo camp. He would always be the man who'd betrayed his own people to settlers and ranchers who knew no other way of thinking. But if Beth could accept that cost, if she could choose him, despite knowing how it would complicate her life, then perhaps he could learn to live with the complications too. By late spring, when they packed their few belongings and prepared to leave the trading post, James felt like a different person than the man who'd arrived at the gathering 6 months earlier. He was no longer looking for simple answers or clear definitions of belonging. He understood now that the real work of love and partnership wasn't in the choosing moment. It was in the months and years afterward, in choosing to stay committed when certainty fell away and all that remained was faith that the choice had been right. Beth smiled at him as they loaded the final items onto their horses. "Ready?" she asked. James looked back at the trading post one last time. Then he turned toward the mountains and the valley beyond, toward the community that had been Beth's home and was becoming his. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready." The seasonal camp where Beth's family spent their spring and early summer was 3 times larger than James had expected. What he'd imagined as a small encampment of perhaps 20 people turned out to be over 70. Multiple extended family groups with their own dwellings, but interconnected through blood, marriage, and shared resources. The Hogans were arranged in clusters, and between them moved the daily life of the community, women weaving, men repairing tools, children playing, elders sitting in the shade discussing important matters. His first morning in the camp, James woke before dawn to the sounds of people already beginning work. The rhythm of the community started early and moved with purpose. He lay in the small hogan Raymond had given them, listening to Beth breathe beside him, trying to calm the anxiety that had awakened him. He didn't belong here. Everyone would know that. Everyone would be watching to see if the white man could adapt, or if he would eventually take Beth away from her people. But when he emerged from the hogan, Margaret was already there with coffee and food. She greeted him the way she might have greeted any family member, with a nod and an expectation that he would join the day's activities. "My brother needs help with the livestock," she said. "He's teaching James how we manage the herds in this territory. You should work with him." It was not a suggestion, it was a direction. And James understood that this was part of his integration. He would be given tasks, expected to complete them, and his performance would be assessed by the entire community without anyone ever explicitly commenting on it. The work was harder than anything he'd done at the trading post. Raymond's brother, Daniel, was a lean man in his 50s who moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent his entire life managing livestock in difficult terrain. He set James to work immediately, checking on animals, identifying which ones needed attention, learning the patterns of movement and behavior that Daniel read like language. "The animals tell you what they need if you pay attention," Daniel explained, showing James how to look at a sheep's coat to determine if it was sick, how to read the way cattle moved to understand if predators were nearby. "Your people think about animals as possessions. We think about them as part of the community. They have needs, they have patterns. If you ignore that, they suffer. If you listen, they thrive." James found himself genuinely engaged by this work in a way he hadn't expected. It required attention and patience, and a kind of respectful observation that felt familiar from his days as a surveyor, looking carefully at landscapes to understand their logic. But instead of mapping terrain for railroad expansion, he was learning to read the needs of living creatures. By midday, he was exhausted and filthy. Daniel seemed satisfied. "You listen," Daniel said. "That's good. Most white men want to tell everything what to do. You're willing to learn what needs to be listened to first. The compliment was understated, but James felt it land with significance. He'd passed the first test, or at least hadn't failed it dramatically. The evenings were different. After the day's work was done, the community gathered around fires. There was food, conversation, and storytelling. James sat near Beth, still an observer but increasingly welcomed into the circle, rather than regarded as an intrusion. One evening, an elder named Arthur, Raymond's father, Beth's grandfather, was telling stories about the long walk, the forced removal of their people from their homeland generations ago. James had read about this in one of the books he'd studied, but hearing it spoken directly by someone whose ancestors had lived through it was entirely different. Arthur's voice didn't carry bitterness, but it carried weight. He described the journey without sentimentality, the losses without self-pity. And when he finished, he looked directly at James. "You are learning our ways," Arthur said in English. "This is good. But you should also learn our history, not the history your schools teach about conquest and civilization. The history of what was taken, what was lost, what we are still fighting to preserve." He paused. "If you will be part of this community, you must understand what community means. We are not just a gathering of people. We are a continuation. Each generation carries forward what the previous generation protected. Do you understand?" "I'm trying to," James said honestly. Arthur nodded slowly. "That trying is where it begins." He turned back to the fire. "My daughter chose well when she chose you. Not because you are perfect, because you are willing to be changed by what you learn. This is the foundation of belonging." Over the following weeks, James began to understand the complexity of community life. Every decision, where to move the herds, when to plant crops, how to respond to a neighboring group's territorial claims, involved consultation and consensus. Leadership wasn't about individual authority, but about earned respect and proven wisdom. Raymond spent time deliberately teaching James about Navajo governance and decision-making processes. They would sit for hours while Raymond explained the logic behind specific choices, the history of conflicts and how they'd been resolved, the long view that guided daily decisions. "We think in generations," Raymond explained one afternoon. "Your people think in years, maybe decades. We think in the span of 7 generations, the ones before us and the ones after. Every choice we make is evaluated against that timeline. Will this strengthen our people for 7 generations? Will it weaken us? This is the question we ask." James found this framework both humbling and clarifying. It made his own ambitions and anxieties seem small. Whether he was accepted or not, whether he felt comfortable or anxious, whether his status was secure, none of that mattered against the longer timeline that Raymond was describing. His relationship with Beth deepened during this period in ways that went beyond physical intimacy. Living in the community, working alongside her, hearing her translate between languages and cultures, watching her navigate between the traditional expectations her family held and her own modern sensibilities, James fell in love with her in a completely different way than he had at the gathering. He saw her intelligence in action, not as an abstract quality, but as something she used constantly to solve problems, mediate conflicts, and create bridges between old and new ways of thinking. He also saw her sacrifice more clearly. The friendships she'd lost, the young women her age who no longer greeted her, the way some community members still treated James with barely concealed hostility, and how Beth had to manage that without explicitly addressing it. One evening, when they were alone in their hogan, Beth broke down in a way James hadn't seen before. She wept, not with dramatic intensity, but with the quiet exhaustion of someone carrying something too heavy for their shoulders. "I love them," she said, referring to her family and community. "I love my culture and my heritage and my responsibility to continue it. But I also love you." And those two things are in constant conflict, and I don't know if I'm betraying both by trying to hold them together." James held her, not offering false comfort or easy reassurance. He just held her while she cried, understanding that she was grieving the version of her life that wouldn't exist because she'd chosen differently. "You're not betraying either," he said finally. "You're creating something new. And creating anything new always means leaving something behind. That doesn't make it a betrayal. It makes it a choice." By late summer, James could speak basic Navajo phrases with genuine comprehension. He could read the signs of weather and terrain. He knew the names and relationships of most people in the camp. He was no longer a complete outsider, though he would never be fully inside. There would always be something in him that marked him as different, but something had shifted in how the community regarded him. The younger men would sometimes invite him to work with them without Beth's involvement. Daniel suggested he was ready to learn more complex aspects of animal husbandry. Margaret began including him in decisions about daily camp logistics in a way that suggested she saw him as a permanent part of the structure rather than a temporary novelty. One afternoon, as James was working on repairing a Hogan roof with Daniel, his brother-in-law spoke something that surprised him. "You're staying," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," James replied. "I'm staying." "Good, because the community needs people who are willing to work, who listen, who understand that they're part of something larger than themselves. You have the capacity for that. Most people don't, whatever their background." Daniel handed James another piece of wood to secure. "You and Beth are going to have difficult years ahead, periods where both communities question you, where you question yourself. But you're building something that matters. Something that shows change is possible without destruction." "I don't know if I'm that important," James said. "You're not," Daniel agreed. "But what you're doing is, that's what matters." The crisis arrived in late autumn, brought by a messenger on horseback who rode into the camp with news that spread through the community like fire through dry grass. The territorial government had announced plans to expand the reservation boundaries, ostensibly to give the Navajo more land, but actually to remove them from areas where valuable mineral resources had recently been discovered. The negotiations were supposedly happening in Santa Fe with only token Navajo representation. Raymond called an emergency council meeting that evening. James watched from the periphery as dozens of community leaders gathered in the largest hogan. The discussion was heated, conducted primarily in Navajo, but James understood enough to grasp the essential conflict. Some people wanted to resist this new boundary adjustment. Others argued that any additional land was better than none. And a third group wanted to send representatives to Santa Fe to negotiate for better terms. It was into this already fractious situation that Marcus arrived. The warrior who'd lost the choosing ceremony to James had spent the past months in the Northern Territories, working as a guide for traders and military scouts. He'd built a reputation as someone who understood both Navajo and white worlds, which made him valuable to both sides. He rode into the camp with two other men, a territorial official and a businessman who introduced himself as representing mining interests. Raymond received them with formal courtesy, but James could see the tension in his bearing. Marcus had not returned to the community since the gathering. His presence now, with these particular companions, suggested something deliberate. The meeting that followed was supposed to be merely informational. The official would explain the territorial government's proposal, and the community could discuss it. But it became clear very quickly that Marcus had a specific agenda. "The territorial government is willing to work with us," Marcus argued, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd been away and believed he'd gained important knowledge. "But they need a representative who understands their way of thinking, someone who can help bridge the gap between what we need and what they're offering. And you believe you're that person?" Raymond said flatly. I believe I'm the only person among us who has the credibility with both communities to make this work, Marcus replied. There was no arrogance in his tone, but there was certainty. I've been working with these men for months. They trust me. More importantly, they listen to me. What happened next broke open the fundamental contradiction that James had been observing all autumn. The community needed someone who could bridge worlds, but trusting that person to do so meant ceding power to them. And power, once ceded, was difficult to reclaim. Beth's father proposed sending a delegation to Santa Fe that included Marcus, but also included other community members, elders, women, people with different perspectives and decision-making authority. The territorial official, however, had been clear. They preferred to work through a single point of contact, one person who could speak with authority and be held accountable for agreements. The meeting dissolved without resolution, but the damage was already done. The community was divided. Some families supported Marcus's approach, seeing pragmatism in his willingness to engage with territorial power structures. Others saw it as a betrayal, an example of someone getting seduced by proximity to power. Beth found James late that evening, sitting alone near their hogan. "This is going to tear the community apart," she said without preamble. "And I think Marcus engineered it deliberately." "Why would he do that?" James asked, though part of him already understood the answer. "Because I chose you," Beth said bluntly. "Because I rejected him and chose someone from outside the community. Because he spent months building his reputation with the territorial government. And now he's proving that he's indispensable in ways I never could be. He's not just negotiating with Santa Fe. He's proving that his path, integrating with the white power structure, is the future. That my path, maintaining cultural identity while building bridges, is naive and impossible." James felt the weight of this settle on him. His presence in the community, Beth's choice of him over Marcus, had become entangled with much larger questions about the community's future and survival. He was no longer just a man in love with a woman. He was a symbol in a conflict that predated him and would outlast him. "What do we do?" he asked. "I don't know," Beth admitted. "My father is trying to navigate between respecting Marcus's capability and maintaining community authority. But Marcus has leverage now. He's demonstrated that he has relationships and knowledge the community needs. That's dangerous for any leader to confront directly." Over the next weeks, Marcus made his case methodically. He brought information from Santa Fe, documented evidence of territorial intentions, and most importantly, he proved consistently that the territorial officials did listen to him and respond to his proposals. He was, by any measure, effective. But effectiveness wasn't the only issue. There was also the question of accountability. When Marcus made agreements with the territorial government, who was he representing? When he spoke for the community, was he really speaking for everyone, or just for those who'd endorsed his approach? The ambiguity created constant tension. The fracture became visible during a community discussion about specific land arrangements. Marcus proposed accepting certain boundary adjustments in exchange for recognition of water rights in a particular region. Several families who depended on that region's grazing land would be displaced, but the water rights, Marcus argued, were more valuable long-term. Daniel stood and challenged this directly. "You're making decisions about people's displacement as if those people aren't present," Daniel said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute clarity. "This is what happens when we give power to one person. They start making choices for the community without the community's actual participation." "I'm presenting proposals for community discussion," Marcus responded. "I'm not making final decisions." "You're presenting proposals as if they're negotiated agreements," Daniel countered. "You're using your relationship with the territorial government to constrain what options we can discuss. That's not bridge building. That's limiting our options to what the other side will accept. The argument escalated into a broader community debate about governance, representation, and the cost of having someone like Marcus serve as intermediary. James watched Raymond navigate this with remarkable skill, trying to validate both the necessity of having someone engage with territorial power and the danger of allowing that person to accumulate too much influence. But something had shifted fundamentally. The unity that James had observed in the camp during the summer was fractured. People were taking sides, not about Marcus specifically, but about what kind of future they wanted and who should have authority to shape it. One evening, Beth pulled James aside and told him something she'd been hesitant to share. "Marcus came to me," she said. "He told me that if I could convince you to leave the community, he could resolve the fracture. That the territorial government is nervous about having a white man integrated into our decision-making structures. That your presence is actually complicating negotiations because the government doesn't know whether to negotiate with him directly or work through Raymond's family." "What did you tell him?" James asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. "I told him I would never ask you to leave based on his political calculations, but I also told him the truth. Your presence here is becoming a political factor, whether we want it to be or not. Not because of anything you've done, but because you represent a choice I made that questioned traditional power structures. And Marcus is using that to prove that traditional structures are what we need." James understood then that his initial fear at the gathering, that his presence would destroy Beth's standing in the community, was coming true, but in a more complex way than he'd anticipated. It wasn't that the community universally rejected him. It was that his presence had become ammunition in an internal conflict about the community's future. "We could leave," James offered, "if that would help resolve." "No," Beth interrupted firmly. "We don't leave. That would be accepting Marcus's framing, that I made a mistake, that the direction I chose was wrong. If we leave, it validates everything he's arguing about the necessity of maintaining separation between communities. I won't do that." But staying meant watching the community fracture further. It meant understanding that sometimes being part of a community meant enduring criticism and division that your presence had catalyzed. It meant accepting that love and belonging could exist simultaneously with conflict and compromise. Raymond, in a quiet conversation with James days later, put it directly. "You've learned our ways," he said. "Now you need to learn our struggles. You need to understand that being part of a community doesn't mean everyone agrees with you or even likes you. It means accepting that you're part of something larger that involves difficult choices and incomplete solutions." Marcus is going to continue negotiating. Some families will support him, others will resist. The community will find a way forward that honors both paths, even though everyone will feel like something was lost. This is how communities survive. Not through perfect unity, but through containing contradiction. Winter came hard that year, with snow arriving early and staying late. The community had to make difficult decisions about resource allocation, and these decisions became another arena where the fractures that had emerged in autumn continued to spread. James found himself at the center of discussions he'd never sought, not because of anything he'd done, but because his presence had become a symbol in a conflict that had little to do with him personally. It started with a practical problem. One of the community's storage structures had deteriorated significantly over the previous summer. Repairs were necessary before winter intensified, but the work was extensive and would require materials they didn't have in abundance. The question became, should they trade with white merchants to get materials quickly, or should they rely on materials available within the community, even though that meant more time and more disruption to other winter preparations? On the surface, this was a simple resource management question. But in the context of everything that had happened, it became a referendum on integration and separation. Marcus argued for using external trade. It was efficient, it demonstrated practical engagement with the broader economy, and it would allow the community to maintain other priorities. Daniel and a faction of elders argued for internal solutions, even if they were slower. They saw the choice as fundamental to maintaining community self-sufficiency and independence. The debate escalated when someone, James never determined who, suggested that James's knowledge of white trading networks made him biased toward external solutions. This wasn't fair and wasn't true, but it reflected the underlying anxiety that his presence created. Any solution he supported or benefited from could be interpreted as favoring integration over autonomy. Beth became his primary defender in these discussions, which only deepened the perception that they were a united front pushing for integration. The irony was that Beth's own vision for the future was far more nuanced than that. She believed in maintaining cultural identity while engaging pragmatically with external forces, but pragmatism often looked like capitulation to those who preferred absolute separation. One evening, after a particularly heated community discussion about resource allocation, Beth and James sat together in their hogan without speaking for a long time. "I'm becoming a liability," Beth said finally. "Not because of anything I've done, but because my choice of you has made me unable to occupy neutral ground. Whatever I support, people interpret through the lens of whether I'm pushing for integration. We could step back," James suggested. "Stop participating in these discussions. Let your father and the elders decide without our input." "That won't work either," Beth replied. "If we step back, it looks like we're isolating ourselves, which validates Marcus's argument that intermarriage creates exactly the kind of separation he's claiming to prevent." "We can't win this, James. Whatever we do is interpreted as evidence against us." This was the realization that marked a turning point in how James understood his role. He wasn't just a man who'd fallen in love with a woman from a different culture. He was now a living embodiment of cultural change, whether he wanted to be or not. His presence triggered deeper anxieties about tradition, autonomy, and the future. The community's debate about his place was really a debate about its own identity. Raymond called him to a private meeting one afternoon. They sat outside the main, gathering hogan, watching the snow fall in heavy, wet clumps that stuck to the pinon trees. "I need to tell you something that will be difficult to hear," Raymond began. "Some members of the council have suggested that you should leave. Not because they believe you're a bad man, but because they believe your presence is preventing the community from moving forward with necessary difficult conversations." James's first instinct was panic, but he forced himself to breathe and listen. "I've told them no," Raymond continued, "but I want you to understand that this pressure exists, and it will likely intensify as the territorial situation becomes more complicated. Marcus is positioning himself as someone who can represent the community's interests because he's not entangled in internal politics. The fact that you are entangled through Beth makes you vulnerable to being sacrificed if the community feels that sacrifice might resolve other conflicts." "What should I do?" James asked. "That depends on what you're willing to do," Raymond replied. "You have three options. First, you could leave. This would resolve the pressure on Beth and allow her to occupy a more neutral position in community discussions. Second, you could stay but become completely silent in community matters, accepting that you have no voice in decisions that affect the community's future. Third, You could stay and continue participating, understanding that you're going to be criticized for whatever position you take. What would Beth want? James asked. That's not the question, Raymond said firmly. The question is what you're willing to commit to. Beth's choice to stay with you was her choice. Now you have to make yours. Whatever you decide, she'll support it. But I won't let her support a decision because you asked her to. I won't let this dynamic become one where her choices are determined by yours. That would make you guilty of the very things some people fear, that you've come into this community and reshaped it around your needs. James sat with this for days. He worked alongside Daniel, completed his responsibilities, and thought about what staying actually meant. He realized that Raymond was offering him something important, the opportunity to take ownership of his position rather than allowing it to be defined by others' reactions to him. He requested a community meeting to speak directly to the concerns that had been circulating. On a cold evening in late December, with snow piling up outside the gathering Hogan, James stood before the assembled community and spoke without Beth beside him. I came to this community as an outsider, he began. I came because Beth's father invited me to witness something important. I stayed because I came to understand that Beth represented something important, a way of being in the world that honored both tradition and change, that didn't see those things as necessarily opposed. My presence here will always be complicated. I will always be the white man. I will always carry associations and histories that some of you find troubling. That's not going to change. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. But I want to be clear about something. I'm not here to change your community. I'm not here to push integration or assimilation or anything else. I'm here because Beth chose me and I chose her, and we're trying to figure out what a shared life looks like when both of us come from different worlds. That's our task. But that task doesn't have to become your task. Your community needs to figure out its own path forward based on your needs and your values, not based on your feelings about me. He looked directly at Marcus. I know you see me as a symbol of everything that's wrong with integration. Maybe you're right about some of those concerns, but I also know that you're using me as a way to avoid difficult conversations about leadership and authority and the community's future. As long as you can point to me as the problem, you don't have to address the real questions about who speaks for this community and how decisions actually get made. Marcus's expression hardened, but he didn't interrupt. Here's what I want to propose, James continued. Let me help with practical work. I'll contribute my labor and my skills where they're useful, but I'll step back from community decision-making discussions, not because I'm forced to, but because that's the appropriate role for someone who isn't born into this community. Let the community make its own choices about its future, and let Beth participate fully in those choices, without it being interpreted as me influencing her through her. The response to this was mixed. Some people nodded in approval, others looked skeptical, but something had shifted. James had offered a way for the community to move past the stalemate, not by resolving the underlying tensions, but by reframing them. Over the following weeks, this approach actually began to work. James continued contributing labor, but stopped attending council meetings or strategy discussions. Beth participated fully, but made it clear that her positions were her own, not influenced by James's perspective. And the community was able to have deeper conversations about its actual future without the distraction of managing his presence. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his negotiations with the territorial government. By early spring, he'd brokered an agreement that gave the community additional land, but also committed them to certain resource extraction limitations. It wasn't perfect, and some families remained unhappy with the compromises. But it was a resolution that moved the community forward rather than keeping it frozen in conflict. One evening in early spring, after a community meeting where Marcus had presented the final territorial agreement, Daniel found James working on repairs to a dwelling. "You handled that well," Daniel said, referring to James's step back from council participation. "You understood something important, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is accept powerlessness. That sometimes the best way to help a community move forward is to get out of the way, not to remove yourself entirely, but to occupy a smaller space than you initially thought you deserved." "I'm not sure I had much choice," James replied. "The community needed to move past the conflict my presence was creating." "That's exactly what I mean," Daniel said. "You could have fought for a place at the table, could have argued that your presence was legitimate. Instead, you recognized that your needs didn't matter more than the community's needs. That's wisdom. That's something most people never learn." 2 years after Beth chose James at the gathering, the community had settled into a new equilibrium. Not stability exactly. The territorial conflicts continued, resource pressures remained constant, and the larger forces reshaping the American West showed no signs of slowing. But the acute fracture that had threatened to tear the community apart had hardened into something manageable. Different factions coexisted, argued productively at times and less productively at others, and moved forward collectively because the alternative was dissolution. Marcus maintained his role as the community's primary negotiator with territorial authorities. He was effective and increasingly trusted by both sides, though some community members never fully forgave him for his ambitions. He married a woman from another Navajo family, consolidated his position through family alliances, and became, in his own way, an important part of how the community navigated its future. He and James achieved a kind of respectful distance, not friendship, but not outright hostility either. They occupied different roles and different spaces, and the community was large enough for both of them. James and Beth had settled into a rhythm of life that neither of them had anticipated, but both recognized as fundamentally right. They maintained their hogan at the edge of the main encampment, occupying a liminal space that reflected their liminal status. James worked consistently with Daniel and other members of the community on practical projects. His skills with construction and problem-solving had made him genuinely valuable, and over time, people had stopped thinking about his being white and started simply thinking about him as the person who knew how to fix things. But their private life, their relationship had deepened in ways that went beyond the external circumstances. They'd learned to navigate disagreements without needing to resolve them completely. They'd learned that partnership didn't require perfect agreement about everything, just commitment to working through the disagreements together. Beth had begun teaching some of the younger girls in the community, not in any formal school structure, but through knowledge passed on during daily work. She taught them about reading and writing in English, about mathematics, about the wider world beyond the Canyonlands. She also taught them about Navajo weaving, about traditional stories, about the history of their people. She refused to frame these things as opposed to each other, insisting instead that understanding multiple perspectives and ways of knowing made you stronger, not weaker. Some families were uncomfortable with this. A few kept their daughters away from Beth's informal teachings, but others saw the value in what she was offering, a way to prepare the next generation to navigate the changing world without losing their connection to tradition. By the end of the second year, Beth had essentially become an informal educator, and this role gave her a kind of authority that transcended the controversy of her marriage to James. In early spring of the third year, Beth discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy was met with a complex mixture of responses. Some people saw it as a source of hope. the tangible symbol that integration could work, that children of mixed heritage could be part of the community. Others saw it as a threat, the beginning of dilution, of a younger generation that would be caught between two worlds and fully at home in neither. Beth herself was ambivalent. She wanted the child deeply, wanted to carry new life, wanted to experience motherhood. But she also understood what her child would face. The child would be neither fully Navajo nor fully white, would grow up navigating dual identities in a world that often demanded you choose one or the other. One evening, as Beth sat with her mother preparing food, she articulated this anxiety. "Our child will have to prove themselves twice," Beth said. "They'll have to prove they're Navajo enough to belong here, and they'll have to prove they're honorable enough to overcome their white father. That's not fair to a child who didn't choose either of those things." Margaret set down her knife and looked at her daughter directly. "Every child has to prove something," she said. "Every generation has to navigate the world they're born into, rather than the world they might have chosen. Your child won't have it easier than other children, but they will have something valuable. Parents who chose each other deliberately, who stayed committed when that commitment was difficult, who've demonstrated that you can honor multiple identities simultaneously. That's worth something." "Is it enough?" Beth asked. "No," Margaret replied honestly. "It won't be enough by itself, but it's a foundation. What your child builds on that foundation will be their own work." James entered the conversation by accident, not expecting to find Beth having this discussion with her mother. But Margaret waved him in, and he sat listening as the two women continued talking about the child they'd created and what their child would inherit. "You should know," Margaret said, looking at James, "that in our tradition, children belong to the mother's clan. Your child will be Navajo first, regardless of your contribution. But the child will also carry your blood and your history. That dual inheritance will shape who they become." I hope you understand that. James did understand. He'd been learning for 3 years what it meant to be part of a community that understood identity as inherited, as something passed through specific lineages and families. His child would be fundamentally Navajo in ways that James himself could never be, no matter how many years he lived among these people. "I want to understand what that means," James said. "I want to learn enough to be able to help our child navigate it." Raymond, who'd been listening from another part of the Hogan, spoke quietly. "That's all anyone can ask. Not that you become something you're not, but that you remain willing to learn." The months of pregnancy changed Beth visibly, not just physically, but in how she moved through the world. She seemed more grounded somehow, more at peace with the contradictions that had troubled her earlier. Knowing that she was creating life seemed to settle some internal conflict about whether her choices had been right. Women in the community gathered around her differently than they had before. Some of the people who'd been most resistant to her marriage seemed to soften slightly. Pregnancy and impending motherhood activated something in the community's collective understanding of women's roles and responsibilities that transcended the controversy of how Beth had come to this point. James found himself being consulted about practical matters by men he'd barely spoken to before. His advice was sought about constructing a cradle board, about preparing the Hogan for a birth, about the responsibilities of fatherhood in the Navajo tradition. He was being absorbed into the community's practical framework in new ways, not as an outsider managing to survive, but as someone genuinely embedded in the community's functioning. In late autumn, as the year turned toward winter, Beth went into labor in the early morning hours. The birth was attended by Margaret and an elder woman named Sarah, who served as the community's primary midwife. James was kept in a separate Hogan, which he initially resented before understanding that this separation was part of respecting the sacred nature of the birth process. He waited through the long day, doing practical work to manage his anxiety, unable to sit still or think clearly. When Daniel found him late in the afternoon, James's hands were shaking. "The birth is taking longer than usual," Daniel said. "But Sarah says nothing is wrong. Sometimes babies take their time coming into the world. It means they're not rushing into life. That's not a bad thing." As darkness fell, a sound came from the birth hogan, not a cry of pain, but a cry of a new human entering the world. The sound was quickly followed by voices, and then Margaret appeared, exhausted but radiant. "You have a daughter," she said. "She's perfect. Beth is tired but healthy. You can go to them now." James entered the hogan to find Beth holding an impossibly small person, wrapped in a blanket that Margaret had made from traditional weaving. The child had James's lighter coloring, but Beth's distinctive features. She was somehow already herself, a unique person who would never be only one thing or the other, but something created entirely new by the combination. "Her name is Sarah," Beth said, referring to the midwife who'd brought her into the world. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell." "Sarah for our helper, Elizabeth for me, Mitchell for you. 3 names for a person who belongs to multiple worlds." James sat beside them as night deepened outside the hogan. He looked at this child who was his biological daughter, but also fundamentally Navajo, who would navigate a world he only partially understood, who would carry forward the legacy of Beth's choice in ways he couldn't predict or fully control. "What do you think she'll become?" he asked Beth. "I don't know," Beth replied. "Something we haven't imagined yet. Something that requires both of us, and also something entirely her own." That's what children are, really. Not extensions of their parents, but new possibilities that neither parent could create alone. In the weeks after Sarah's birth, the community underwent another subtle shift. The presence of a mixed-race child changed something fundamental about how people thought about integration and identity. Sarah wasn't a theoretical question anymore. She was a person, belonging to families, claiming relationships, embedded in the community through her mother's clan. Some people remained uncomfortable, but others began to see her not as a problem to be managed, but as a continuation of the community's future. And that shift, subtle as it was, suggested that the path James and Beth had chosen, difficult, complicated, never perfectly accepted, might actually become possible for others who came after them. 5 years had passed since the gathering where Beth pointed at James. It was a spring morning, and the seasonal camp had grown even larger than it had been during those early years. More families had chosen to join the main encampment, drawn by the stability Raymond and his council had managed to create despite ongoing territorial pressures and changing political dynamics. James stood at the edge of a newly constructed schoolhouse, a structure built collaboratively by the community to house Beth's increasingly formal educational work. The building was modest but substantial, constructed using both traditional building techniques and some of the practical innovations James had introduced over the years. It represented something that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. An investment of community resources in formalized education that bridged both Navajo tradition and Western knowledge. The school existed because Beth had pushed for it, because the community had come to recognize the value of what she was teaching, and because Raymond had used his political authority to advocate for it, despite some resistance. It was one of many changes that had accumulated gradually as a result of James and Beth's choice. Sarah, now 5 years old, played with other children near the schoolhouse while her mother prepared the space for the day's lessons. The girl had her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's practical directness. She moved between English and Navajo effortlessly, belonged completely to neither world and utterly to both simultaneously. But the children accepted her without the self-consciousness that had characterized some adults' initial reactions. James watched his daughter and felt Something settled in his chest that hadn't been there 5 years ago. The uncertainty, the questioning whether his presence was damaging or destructive, these things hadn't disappeared entirely, but they'd been joined by something more substantial: evidence, visible proof that the moment at the gathering wasn't an aberration, but the beginning of something that would endure. That afternoon, as Beth was preparing materials for the schoolhouse, Henry arrived on horseback. Henry was one of the warriors from the original gathering, the quiet one whom Beth had spoken with during the final days before the choosing ceremony. He was now engaged to one of Beth's younger cousins, and his presence in the community had evolved from competitor to accepted member with his own contributions and relationships. "I wanted to speak with you," Henry said to James, requesting privacy. They walked beyond the encampment to a spot overlooking the valley, where the afternoon light painted the rock formations in shades of amber and deep orange. "I'm getting married next month," Henry began, "and I wanted to ask if you would participate in the ceremony. Not in a central role, that wouldn't be appropriate, but I wanted your presence to acknowledge something." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The ceremony between you and Beth opened something. It showed that the traditions could hold more than we thought they could. That choice didn't destroy our culture. It expanded what was possible. And now I'm standing here, about to marry someone, thinking about a future that looks different than the futures our fathers imagined. I'm thinking about including education in my children's lives, because Beth's teaching has shown how valuable it is. I'm thinking about partnerships differently. I'm thinking about whether love should be constrained by tradition or whether tradition should be flexible, enough to honor love when it arrives." Unexpectedly, Henry looked directly at James. "What you and Beth did, it wasn't just about the two of you. It created a new possibility in our community's consciousness. Other young people are looking at your life and seeing that you can choose differently without betraying who you are. I want you to understand the full weight of what that means. You're not just a man who married a Navajo woman. You're a symbol of transformation. And that comes with responsibility." James didn't know how to respond to this articulation of something he'd sensed, but never heard named so directly. 5 years ago, the idea that his presence could catalyze positive change seemed like wishful thinking. But Henry was right. Something had shifted in the community's understanding of what was possible. "I'll be there," James said simply. That evening, Raymond invited James to sit with him and several other community leaders. They were discussing the territorial negotiations that Marcus was currently conducting, and they wanted James's perspective on what white businessmen and government officials might actually want beneath their stated positions. This was notable. 3 years ago, James had stepped back from direct participation in council discussions. But he hadn't been excluded from all input. Rather, his role had evolved into something different. He was consulted as an interpreter of cultural contexts, as someone who could help the community understand the broader world they had to navigate. He was still an outsider, but he was an outsider whose outsider perspective had genuine value. The discussion lasted hours, ranging from tactical questions about specific negotiations to deeper, philosophical questions about whether engagement with territorial authorities was corrupting the community's independence or merely practical adaptation to changed circumstances. James found himself contributing not answers. He rarely had those, but useful questions that helped the leaders clarify their own thinking. As the discussion ended and people began departing, Raymond asked James to remain. "I want to tell you something I've never said directly," Raymond began, settling back into his seat by the fire. "When you came to the gathering, I thought you were a good man trying to do an impossible thing. I invited you partly out of respect for you, and partly because I wanted Beth to see exactly how impossible it was. I thought seeing all the suitable Navajo warriors would help her understand what she was choosing against. Instead, she chose you, and I realized I'd misjudged something fundamental about her character. What was that? James asked. That she wasn't choosing against the community. She was choosing differently within it. She was saying that the community was large enough to hold contradictions, that tradition didn't require rigid separation, that we could evolve without losing ourselves. That took a kind of courage I didn't fully recognize at the time. Raymond paused, his weathered face reflecting the firelight. And you matched that courage by staying committed through all the difficulty. Through the rejection, the politics, the uncertainty. You didn't come to rescue anyone or prove anything. You simply stayed and worked and built something real with my daughter. That's rare. Most people, when they encounter resistance, retreat. They decide the cost is too high. You never did that. James listened to this without interrupting, understanding that Raymond was saying something he'd carried for years and finally felt safe enough to articulate. I was wrong about some things, Raymond continued. I underestimated my daughter's wisdom. I underestimated the community's capacity for change. And I underestimated what it would actually cost you to stay. I see it now in ways I didn't then. You gave up your place in your own world to become someone between worlds. That's a harder choice than I initially understood. I wanted you to know that I recognize that sacrifice, and I'm grateful for it. Later, as James was settling Sarah into sleep, his daughter asked him a question that he'd been anticipating for years, but still wasn't fully prepared to answer. Why do some people not like that Mama married you? Sarah asked, her 5-year-old mind navigating complexity with the directness of childhood. She was lying in her small bed, wrapped in a blanket her grandmother Margaret had woven specifically for her, with traditional patterns that nonetheless incorporated Sarah's own name in the design. Because I'm different from them, James replied carefully, sitting on the edge of her bed. I come from a different place. My skin is different. My family is different. Some people think that different is bad, that it means I don't belong here. But you do belong here, Sarah stated with absolute certainty. You help build things. You work with Uncle Daniel. You're here, and you're my daddy. Yes, James agreed. I do belong here now, but it took time for people to understand that. Some people still don't believe it, and that's something you'll probably have to navigate in your own life. People who won't believe that you belong, or who think you should choose one world instead of being part of both. Will I choose? Sarah asked, her eyes growing heavy as sleep began to claim her. That's up to you, James said. But I hope you'll understand that you don't have to. You can be both things. You can honor your Navajo heritage and also understand the wider world. You can move between cultures without being fully owned by either one. That's harder than choosing just one, but it's also more interesting. It means you'll understand things that people who only belong to one world can never fully grasp. You'll be able to translate between different ways of seeing reality. That's a gift. Even when it's difficult, Sarah considered this solemnly, then fell asleep, carrying her father's hopes into dreams James couldn't imagine or control. Later that night, James found Beth sitting alone outside their hogan, looking up at the stars that filled the sky with their infinite distance and incomprehensible vastness. Henry asked me to participate in his ceremony, James said, settling beside her. He said what we did opened new possibilities for others. It did, Beth replied, though not always in ways we could have predicted or controlled. Some of those possibilities are good, some are complicated. Some are things we couldn't have anticipated when we made our choice at the gathering. Do you regret it? James asked. He'd never asked this directly before, had been somewhat afraid of the answer. Beth was quiet for a long time. I regret some of the cost it's imposed on you, she said finally. I regret that you gave up your place in your own community. I regret that you'll never fully belong anywhere. that you exist in a permanent liminal space. I regret that some of my own relationships have been damaged or complicated by my choice. She turned to look at him. But I don't regret choosing you. I don't regret Sarah. I don't regret the life we've built. Because what we've done has meaning that extends beyond our own happiness. We've demonstrated something that needed to be demonstrated, that love doesn't have to operate within predetermined categories. That communities can hold more complexity than tradition sometimes acknowledges. That you can honor your heritage while also embracing change. Henry said I was responsible for that, James said. For being a symbol of transformation. That carries weight, it does, Beth agreed. But you've already been carrying that weight for 5 years. You've been doing it unconsciously. Through your actions, through your refusal to retreat, even when retreating would have been easier. Now you're just becoming conscious of it. That's actually a kind of relief, I think. To name something you've already been living. Years would pass after this conversation. Sarah would grow up and carve out her own path, one that neither fully replicated her parents' choices, nor rejected them entirely. She would become a teacher like her mother and a builder like her father. She would marry someone from within the community, a young man named Joseph who'd grown up watching James integrate into the community and whose own sense of what was possible had been expanded by that observation. Sarah's children would carry forward the legacy of what James and Beth had begun, creating yet another generation that understood identity as something fluid and multifaceted rather than fixed. The community itself would continue to change, sometimes visibly and sometimes in ways that only revealed themselves over decades. More intermarriage would occur between Navajo and white settlers as the territorial borders became increasingly blurred. Some of these partnerships would work as well as James and Beth's had. Others would founder under pressures and contradictions. But the fact that such partnerships would even be attempted, that they wouldn't be immediately rejected as inherently corrupting, that was partly due to the template that James and Beth had established. Marcus would continue his work as a negotiator, eventually becoming one of the most respected representatives of Navajo interests to territorial authorities. His ambitions, once seen as threatening to community cohesion, would eventually be channeled into genuine service. He would never be friends with James, but he would develop a professional respect for him. And in his later years, Marcus would occasionally reflect on how his own trajectory might have been different if Beth had chosen him instead of James. Not with bitterness. He'd built a full and meaningful life, but with the kind of philosophical awareness that comes from understanding that the path not taken might have led somewhere entirely different. Raymond would age with the dignity he'd carried throughout his life. He would see his grandchildren grow up in a world that was simultaneously more integrated and more politically fraught than the world he'd been born into. He would spend his final years as a living repository of history, telling stories to younger generations about what had been and what had changed and what endured despite transformation. On his deathbed, one of the last things he said to James was, "You became Navajo not by birth, but by commitment." That's something our people should remember. That belonging is sometimes created through choice rather than inheritance. But in that moment, sitting under the stars with Beth on that spring evening, James didn't know any of this future. He knew only what he could see. A community that was learning to hold contradictions. A wife who'd made a choice and lived into it with consistent devotion. A daughter who embodied possibility, and his own place in a world that would never fully be his, but that he'd helped to reshape through the simple act of staying. "Do you think we changed anything?" James asked Beth. "We changed everything," she replied. "And nothing. The territorial conflicts will continue. The community will face pressure from external forces we can't control. Some people will always see our choice as a betrayal. Others will always see it as insufficient. That's the nature of transformation. It's never complete. It's never universal. It's always contested and partial and ongoing." She paused. "But we changed something fundamental in people's sense of what's possible. And that possibility will extend into generations we'll never meet, shaping lives we'll never know about. That's the legacy we've created. Not perfection, not resolution, but possibility. The mountains stood eternal, bearing witness to small human dramas that mattered tremendously to those who lived them while being utterly insignificant in the vast sweep of geological time. But that didn't make those dramas less real or less meaningful. It just meant that meaning was something humans created through their choices, their commitments, their willingness to try something new even when it was frightening. Beth called to him from the hogan, and James turned to go to her. 5 years of choosing her every single day. 5 years of proving that the moment at the gathering wasn't an aberration, but the beginning of something that would endure. And ahead of them, years uncounted, filled with challenges he couldn't anticipate, with joys he couldn't predict, with the ongoing work of building a life that honored multiple truths simultaneously. He took her hand as he entered the hogan, and in that gesture, so simple, so ordinary, so revolutionary in its simplicity, the entire arc of their journey was contained. From the moment he'd noticed her at the trading post, from the moment she'd pointed at him at the gathering, from all the months of difficulty and doubt, to this present moment where love had become not just an emotion but an identity, a way of being in the world, a commitment to something larger than individual happiness. The fire in the hogan burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and in those shadows lived all the stories of all the people who'd come before them, and all the stories yet to come, and the story that James and Beth were still actively creating. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of turning toward each other rather than away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.